Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's The Tom Woods Show, episode 2544, with Darryl Cooper, or Martyr Made. You may know that account from what I still insist on calling Twitter. I am weakening, however, but I'm still for now insisting on calling it Twitter. And you may be a teensy-weensy bit familiar with our guest, given that he's been denounced by the White House since I think the moment I asked if he'd come on. I mean, it's just gone completely wild here because of his interview with Tucker Carlson. But he has is it the Martyr Made podcast?
Yes.
And you've done some long-form content that's been very valuable, that a lot of my friends say is absolutely top-notch. But you had this conversation with Tucker Carlson that went down a road you yourself weren't necessarily expecting to go down, but since you are a historian and these conversations with Tucker are very free-form, you never really know, I suppose, where they might go. And they went in a direction that I think it's fair to say turned your life upside down. And I don't want to spend our time talking about rehashing Winston Churchill and all that. I have an episode of The Tom Woods Show from 10 years ago where I had Pat Buchanan on, and he was saying the same thing. So it's not like no one's ever said these things before, but it's weird that even though the internet has liberated us to get exposed to different kinds of ideas and people, at the same time, it has just brought into overdrive, maybe because of that, the kind of people who want to clamp down on this and hysterically so. Anyway, I haven't even let you say hello. Well, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tom. It is great to be here. As I told you off the air, I've been a big fan for a long time, despite everything Michael Malice says about you. I don't believe any of it. So it's an honor.
That SOB. He's always up to something. The other day on his podcast, he had a guest, and at the end, he always asks, what was your favorite part of the interview? And she said, well, I love the fact that you were really informed. Whereas I was just on a podcast where the host didn't know anything and I had to start from zero. And Malice had it so that as she was saying this, his face morphed into mine like I was the one who didn't know anything. I mean, he's constantly doing this. And I'm the straight man. It's not funny if I shoot back at him. But anyway, let's talk about you, because you are, I think, up to now anyway, the most notorious person I've had on the Tom Woods Show. So talk to me about this conversation with Tucker and then what happened.
Sure. So, to start at the very, very beginning of it, really like what maybe started my trouble was in Tucker's intro and something you just said. You referred to me as something like the greatest historian America's ever seen or something like that. And I'm not a historian. I'm not an academic historian. I'm a history nerd with a podcast. And the night before, actually, Tucker and I were at dinner, and we had that argument. He kept calling me a historian. I kept trying to say, well, look, there's work that historians do that like I rely on. I'm maybe popularizing the stuff, a storyteller, but I'm not. And he said, yeah, well, tomorrow on the show, I'm going to call you a historian anyway, and I don't want to argue about it on the show. Roger that. Tucker tells you don't argue, you don't argue. And so we talked for 2 hours, maybe 2 hours, 10 minutes or so. And about an hour and a half into it or something, he decided to bring up World War II, which was briefly a topic of our conversation the night before at dinner. And I was not prepared to talk about World War II. I didn't know we were going to talk about it. But he brings it up, and, well, as you said, I've been denounced by the White House, CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post for what really amounts to regurgitating Pat Buchanan circa 2007, 2008 points, or points that were made by British historians like A.J.P. Taylor decades ago. But I think you made a very important point, which is that you actually could talk about these things sort of not that long ago. Pat Buchanan obviously caught his share of flack, but he could talk about it. and not get the hysterical emotional incontinence that I was subjected to last week. And I think that the internet and the fact that the boundaries that are protecting a lot of these historical mythologies are starting to break down. And that means that the defenses of them are becoming, stiffer and more desperate than they were before.
Well, it seems to me, now, I guess I am a historian because I have the fancy degrees, but I've always been the sort of person to say that there's no reason that we with the fancy degrees should monopolize the telling of history. I wasn't let in on any special techniques that only I know and that a simply well-informed person wouldn't know. So this whole mystique around the historical profession is entirely misplaced, if you ask me. And I think what you do is vastly more valuable than so much of the bunk that comes out of the official historical profession. You try to go to a meeting of the Organization of American Historians and keep a straight face through that thing, it's impossible. It is, if I were to tell you the names of some of the papers being presented there, you would think I was making them up just to laugh at these people. So not for a second should we. I agree with Tucker on this. You are every bit as much a historian as these people are. But when it comes to these sorts of topics, anytime I get the feeling that I'm hitting a third rail, that I'm hitting something that all the respectable people are telling me to stay away from, then I wonder what's really going on here. Nobody, if I were to argue Napoleon helped to spread natural rights theory throughout Europe in the course of his invasions, or conversely, to argue that Napoleon was a terrible dictator who caused Europe unending grief, well, we can argue about that, right? I mean, we don't. Nobody says, well, you're the worst person who ever lived. And the fact is, I think the telling of the story of the 20th century has been is largely a fairy tale. It's a fairy tale that, on a very comic bookish level, reaches conclusions that are meant to flatter the existing regimes. And so when you get warmer and warmer, like World War II, and we're supposed to believe that this was a comic book and Winston Churchill was what they all say Winston Churchill was, don't get too close there. And I say, screw that. All this history that flatters the king, in effect, isn't doing anybody a bit of good, and it's about time we looked at it in more detail.
I think whenever you have a historical event that's a load-bearing story, right? That there are power structures, that there are certain class relationships or privileges of different groups of people or anything like that are resting on it. It's going to be set about with taboos and prohibitions and areas that, maybe you are allowed to ask questions, maybe in a certain way, but it's not an area where you're allowed to ask quote unquote dumb questions, right? Which you have to be able to do that in order to be able to really explore a topic, And so for us, I mean, if you look at the American Revolution, which, there was a time in our history that if you wanted to make fun of George Washington, the average American would probably punch you in the face. That's not really the case anymore. That's sort of faded, I suppose, through time and demographic transformation to the point that doesn't quite have the emotional valence that it once did. But for us, it's the Civil War to a certain degree. It's World War II, and it's the Civil Rights Movement and everything that's kind of followed from that. Those, and they're all kind of connected. And you see it in the rhetoric of politicians and the way the popular narrative talks about those three events, that they're really a continuation of this one long battle. They were still fighting today with Donald Trump versus et cetera. And so there's a lot riding on it. And really none of them, as we saw this last week. I mean, Tucker told me that in 30 years of being in media, and it's not as if he's been averse to confrontation and, just touching on things that maybe are not popular among a lot of people himself. He says he's never seen anything like it in 30 years. So Being at the center of that was a very interesting experience, but I learned a lot from it. And I think we all kind of did just by watching the experience, the reaction itself.
As I'm sure you knew before, but you really had it rammed into your head now. It's very, very hard to have a serious conversation with people who are not engaging you from a position of goodwill. And this is true of anything involving any war the U.S. has ever been in. Oh, you must love the Kaiser because you're against Woodrow Wilson. Or you must love Saddam because you don't like George W. Bush. It's all dumb, like low IQ stuff. Or you must love Hitler because you think Churchill was a person, which, as you say, there is a huge literature coming from the left and the right arguing that there's a reasonable chance that Churchill may actually have been a person rather than the deity he's held up to us as. And I always, when I interact with people, because I go to a lot of conferences, I get invited to this, that, or the other thing, and I usually can get an assessment of who these people are I'm addressing very, very quickly. And so when I get, when the conversation turns to something like Churchill and it's all adulation, I think, all right, I know who these people are. I mean, they're willing to go this far, which is farther than some people, I'll grant them, but this is where they are. They've still got a foot and out of their 2 feet, they have a foot and a half still in the establishment. But okay, I can work with them because at least half a foot is somewhere else. But that's all. That to me is one of those indicators. And in U.S. history, there are certain figures also. If I hear adulation about them, I know something about the person, and I'll say, okay, well, this person is willing to go so far, but only so far. And definitely, Churchill is one of those in world history. But was there any point in this situation, in this ordeal that you've endured, where you were genuinely, like, I don't know, I don't want to say frightened, but we do have some pretty deranged people out there in 2024 America. Was there any part of this that made you feel like I'm in big trouble, I might have to switch careers or anything like that? Or did you feel like if I just dig in my heels, I'm going to come through this on the other side okay?
Yeah, well, that's one of the lessons that we've learned, I think, this last week, which is that we live in a new world. If you would have gone back 10, 20 years ago, the people who are upset, who I maintain, and all my experience is it's just a very, very loud minority of people. They could have destroyed my life. They had the power to do that. They had the power to shut me up and ruin my life. They don't have that power anymore. My subscribers to my podcast are at record highs. I was, thanks largely to the people condemning me, I think, was a #1 podcast overall, ahead of Tucker, ahead of Joe Rogan, ahead of everybody all week last week on iTunes and Spotify. Still the #1 history podcast across the board. And so there's a record number of people listening. A lot of people have subscribed who weren't subscribed before. And so, I have a Substack, which is one of the ways that I raise money to support the podcast. And almost as soon as this happened, I got outreach from people at the company, involved in the company, letting me know that, that they had my back. And that's just something that a company or a person, especially somebody with a public profile, but really anybody at all, wouldn't have been able to risk, just a few years ago. And I would have understood and not even been upset with them, right? Because we all answer to somebody. And that's encouraging, but I also think it plays a role in why the reaction has been so hysterical. Because that power that they've had for a long time, I mean, World War II, you talk about Saddam and Iraq, or the Kaiser in World War I. It was the same during the war, maybe, for a couple of years afterwards, but then it lost its hold, right? And then all of a sudden you can talk about those things however you want, and you can really dig into them and look at every angle and ask questions about the results of those conflicts. And World War II, it's been with us, that myth. And when I say myth, I don't mean that it's a lie. I just mean that it's a load-bearing story in our culture, it's been with us for 80 years. And if anything, over the years, it's actually become less questionable. It's become less okay to talk about it. Again, like a lot of the stuff I was saying was said by respected British historians in the decades right after the war. And so the internet's changing things. And I mean, it's really a larger, it's rather a microcosm of the larger picture that we're seeing, right? Which is that the powers that be had total control, total narrative control for so long. And they never planned on the internet coming along, It's one of the funny things when you go back and look at it's why the Epstein thing, I think, is such a phenomenon, and even things like the JFK assassination, whatever it is, when you go back now and look at them, you look at it and you're amazed at man, they weren't even trying. When they put out this story, this is just clearly a ridiculous story, obviously. But when you got 3 channels and couple newspapers and that's what's going out, you can actually do that. And so the people were very sloppy with a lot of things, with a lot of these narratives over the years. And now that the internet's out there and people can sit back and look at it if they're willing to, you see censorship drives, you see, emotional reactions like we saw last week, cancel culture, etc.
Folks, this month marks 11 years of The Tom Woods Show. And over the course of those years, we've talked an awful lot about U.S. politics, and we've talked about how stupid and crazy and evil it is. But for the first time in my life, I'm genuinely looking at U.S. politics and devising an escape plan. And I hope you are too. I am very proud to be speaking at the Expat Money Summit, the world's largest offshore event, taking place entirely online October 7th to 11th, hosted by Mikkel Thorup, who is the host of the Expat Money Show, a repeat Tom Woods Show guest, and a highly sought-after expat consultant with over 2 decades of experience. He's one of the most impressive people I know. He just knows everything about everything on this sort of topic. He and others will teach you why international diversification is a must for those looking to preserve their liberty and wealth. But beyond that, there's never been a more urgent time to develop a Plan B. And here's where you can learn everything you need to know about crafting your perfect Plan B. How to quickly acquire a second passport, diversify your finances offshore, invest in international real estate, and get in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. Headline speakers include Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Old Woods here, Mark Faber, Tom Luongo, and more. To reserve your complimentary ticket, yes, it is free, head over to expatmoneysummit.com. That's expatmoneysummit.com. Of course, the Enlightenment had this prejudice against things that were traditional, things that were handed down. And that included purported scientific knowledge, ideas about government. All these things had to be, I wouldn't say they were presumed wrong, but they had to justify themselves before the bar of reason. And that was the way the Enlightenment put it. Now, whether they succeeded in that or not, or whether that was a good thing to do or not is beside the point. But I kind of feel like I'm in a similar situation, that after I've observed the way certainly the American regime operates, and, at a distance, I also would say some of the other Western regimes, at this point, I feel like, let's say, ideas and interpretations that we've accepted for a long time themselves cannot simply continue to be accepted on that basis, simply because it's something everybody knows, quote unquote, or all the respectable people say X, therefore you better believe X. I feel like, especially, my goodness, if COVID didn't wake you up, and to the medical establishment, public health, the regime itself, a lot of other things ought to have done so in recent years. But my point is, after observing with my own eyes how the states, let's call it that they basically are, they may as well be state media, the states' newspapers and media outlets, the way they distort things even in the very headlines they use. The headlines are propaganda. Forget about the article. When I look at time after time, things that have been distorted to the point of absurdity, well, these headlines become tomorrow's history because the people writing history are cut from the same cloth as the people distorting the headlines. So I am inclined to say that, no, I'm not just going to accept something because the respectable people tell me that it was so. At this point, I feel like everything is thrown into doubt. And it's up to good, decent people to rebuild the intellectual edifice of the West.
Yeah, and the trap you can fall into is just being a reflexive contrarian about everything because of what you just said, right? And a lot of people do exactly that. You take the World War II story, and it's so protected by whatever, all the forces that manifested themselves last week against me, right? And it's protected by not just those external forces. Like, all of us are brought up in a way that we've got emotional triggers built into us from childhood, from our education, from media that we were raised on, that let us know that make us feel like we're venturing into like blasphemous territory if we start to ask certain questions. So there's real like inhibitions to treating that as anything other than a sacred story. And whenever that's the case, the only people who are really going to be asking questions about it are fools like me, or people with nothing to lose, or people with bad intentions. And that's what you see a lot, right? So
Yes.
On one of my podcasts, I talked about this, how, obviously anybody who's been on Twitter over the last several years has seen that there's been a rise in anti-Semitism, at least online, in the way it's being expressed. And I've seen people I know, people I'm friends with, and people like, I'm not talking about, you'd be shocked if I told you the positions they were in and who these people were, where they start looking into World War II. They start finding out that there are things about it that they're not being told by court historians. So they go out looking. Maybe they go ask somebody. They ask their history professor or something, and then they just get shouted out of class or told, that they ought not ask that question in so many words, one way or another. And what they find is that the only person that seems to have been honest with them about like this one particular point is, a guy on the internet in the comments section of some article on a website that he probably is now on a list for visiting, And so he starts to think that these are the only people that are telling me the truth about this stuff. And all this other stuff is a lie. And I've seen people get caught in that, where it becomes, I have one friend, he's still a friend, very well put together guy, very educated, very smart. If I told you his job, you'd be shocked. Like, very well put together. To this day, even starts going down this rabbit hole, and he got himself to the point where like his friends, people like us, like literally could not bring him into mixed company because he couldn't go 10 minutes without bringing up Adolf Hitler or the Jews or something like that. That happens to people, and that's a real thing. And it's sort of indicative of like,
listen,
you have all of this emotional power.
I was just going to say, my email inbox is filled with correspondence from people like this, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, right. All of my Twitter comments have a bunch of that, and so that's sort of the flip side of the overwhelming emotional power that this issue has on one side of the ledger, where you have to protect this sacred story at all costs. The flip side of that is that it has a tremendous amount of valence, for people who are contrarians to the story. Any generation is going to have its share of devil worshippers. And in modern America, in the modern West, the devil's not the devil anymore. Hitler's the devil. The Nazis are the legions of hell. And so they sort of stand in for that impulse that gives us Satan worshipers, in every generation. It's just, that impulse to reject and stand against everything that is around you. It manifests in that way. And that's very destructive, and the reason that so many people get caught up listening to people like that, people who really do hate the Jews, people who really do want you to hate the Jews, is because people who don't hate anybody but want to talk about this stuff get a reaction like I got last week. It's almost nobody does it. And I think we'd all be better off. I think everybody would be, well, from the standpoint of truth, we'd all be better off. But again, there are serious power structures. You could say, I mean, if you go down the line of like the list of things that really rest on that story being a fairy tale, as you described it. I mean, the U.S.-led global order is, as you said, every single war we've gone to has been against the next Hitler, who, if we don't fight him now, we're going to have to fight him later when he's much stronger, and it'll be much worse, right? That's justified every war that we've been in since the Second World War. If you look at the sort of special privileges that are accorded to the state of Israel in terms of, a special status that makes it so that the United States and most Western countries in general, give just unquestioning, unconditional support to the state of Israel, regardless of the situation or anything. It's an unconditional thing. A lot of that rests on the story of World War II being, this sort of load-bearing mythology. The fact that if you think about like the whole post-1960s social justice ideology that's codified in civil rights law, that sort of holds. I think there's Supreme Court precedent even that has written this into the law. That if there's a disparate representation of certain groups of people in a given profession or in any setting, that is prima facie evidence of something nefarious going on. There's some kind of discrimination happening, or something's going on there that the state has the authority and the imperative to go in and actually correct, right?
Sometimes you think you just have no choice. You have to deal with people and companies that hate you, or at the very least don't respect you, because what else are you going to do? But sometimes you do have a choice and you just don't know it. So take big tech, for example. Think about Apple, Google, Microsoft. They're all engaging in all kinds of shenanigans with your private data. And you think, well, what am I going to do? Well, you can avoid all that by not using their so-called free tools in the first place. Instead, check out Federated Computer. They offer a full replacement for Google, Microsoft Office 365, Slack, Zoom, all the tools of big tech, but designed for people who care about privacy, don't want to be treated like cattle, and want a great price. Everything's encrypted end-to-end, fully backed up daily. We're talking about private email, file storage, group chat, WordPress, all the applications you need for your business or team bundled into one easy monthly subscription that's 10 times less expensive than big tech offerings. You get unlimited users, fantastic personal customer service by actual human beings, and the assurance that your private data is actually your private data. Visit www.federated.computer for your free 30-day trial and use coupon code WOODS for 10% off your first 6 months. So how about that? A company that thinks its job is to, provide you with services for a great price rather than spying on you or shutting you up or manipulating you. So take your first step along with other Happy Woods listeners towards digital freedom. Visit www.federated.computer today for your free 30-day trial and use coupon code WOODS to take 10% off your first 6 months. Well, note that I don't say that I assume everything is wrong, as I'm not going to accept it simply because it's the established view, it's the standard view. That's not enough. Now, there might have been a time when I would have said, well, why would I distrust the experts, right? This is the standard accepted view of things. Why would I distrust? Well, let's think about this. Think about the past 8 years and think about how future authors of American history textbooks that will be approved for use in American public schools, imagine how they're going to portray the last 8 years. It will be nothing but falsehoods. Russiagate will be covered, and there will be some acknowledgement that there was difficulty really pinning it down, but you won't get a sense that the left was absolutely routed on that. I could go on. COVID will be portrayed as the wise public servants tried their best, but unfortunately a bunch of stupid heads who hate science were constantly getting in the way. The Ukraine thing, forget about that. There's absolutely no way you're going to get anything other than cheerleading and propaganda on that. And we could just go down through the Trump years, everything. It is going to be an absolute mess. And so I hope people in the future, when they look at their history book, I hope they'll say, I'm not so sure about this. I wonder if there's another way of thinking about these issues. I wonder if there's another perspective on these issues, the same way I would hope somebody looking at the Great Depression might say, maybe there's another explanation than the one in this textbook. And you know what? There is. Or maybe it'd be nice if we had young people who would look at the stuff about the New Deal in the 1930s and ask, well, did this actually help? Or, what happened to unemployment in the 1930s? These are the kinds of questions that the textbook historian just blanks out on. You get nice pictures of people with pickaxes or shovels or whatever being put to work, and that's supposed to make you feel good, but they don't have the unemployment statistics because they figure the kids won't ask, and what they don't know won't hurt them. That's what I mean. The kids going through history class today come out with a progressive worldview, because why wouldn't you?
You brought up Russia and Ukraine, and I have the thought that that's really a perfect example of why a historical event like the Second World War becomes the kind of load-bearing myth I'm talking about, right? I mean, and what I'm about to say is not me saying Vladimir Putin is Hitler, or that Russia is National Socialist Germany or anything like that. But if you look at the historical parallels, to me, they're remarkable, right? You have a country that was defeated in a war, quote unquote, like in a way that they didn't exactly feel like they were routed and defeated, that they had to unconditionally surrender, like the Soviet Union. And they never saw it that way. They see it as them voluntarily reaching out to make peace. And I think that's the right read on it with Gorbachev. But they see that, and then they collapse, and they go through an entire decade where the people are just absolutely degraded, and their culture is degraded, and they're treated as a decadent playground by the victorious powers, right? Just like Weimar Germany, you had that in the 90s in Russia, just a total disaster where you've got former generals, in the Soviet army who are on the street begging for change. And people see things like that. Women who were middle-class, respectable women who are prostituting themselves because they're literally facing the possibility of starvation, and it's just the culture itself being degraded and pulled down in a way that's humiliating. And given the way that the conflict that left them in this state ended, makes them feel extremely betrayed. And eventually somebody comes along, like Adolf Hitler, like Vladimir Putin, who, through means that are, not fit for a town hall meeting in Vermont, manages to put the state back together and reestablish its authority and actually reconstitute the society into something that at least is orderly and prosperous, and that people can actually think ahead to the next year because they have a fairly solid idea of where they're going to be and what they're going to be doing, and society kind of gets started again. But in so doing, made it so that place is no longer a playground for the victorious powers. This is a state that's now reasserting its sovereignty, on the international level. And rather than in both of those situations, and this was like really central to my criticism of Churchill, rather than recognizing the really just the level of trauma that those societies, whether Germany or Russia in the 90s, experienced, and without trying to understand their perspective on what had happened to them and why they had fallen into this state, and not trying to, and in fact, once they started reestablishing themselves, almost immediately beginning to treat them like an enemy. And then, and this is again, not to say that they didn't do their part to provoke either, but it's not what it's about. But when you have a situation like this, where society has been through what they've been through, you have an explosive situation that I think, if you want to consider yourselves the responsible party, right, which is the way we think of somebody like Churchill, you have a responsibility to try to de-escalate these situations. And instead of what we did with Russia instead of what I maintain the British establishment in general, but then Churchill did with Adolf Hitler, which is to use a maximum pressure approach and to just push and push and push to make it clear that what you're doing in terms of reasserting yourself on the international scale and level and everything else is simply not going to be tolerated. And that ends up, and it ended up in both of those situations with a closed off, paranoid, like a society that felt itself under siege by the West. You know, that's what happened in the 30s. It's what happened in really the 2010s, especially like in Russia. You know, they feel under siege, and then and then they feel backed into a corner where they have to get into a conflict, which people can say that's crazy in the case of Germany. I'm sure they will. But the primary sources, I think, are very clear on it. You know, we don't have to agree. But from their perspective, they were backed into a corner, just like with Vladimir Putin. Like, he 100% believes that Russia was backed into a corner and had to go into Ukraine. And again, whether we agree with that or not is really immaterial. Our goal should be to avoid hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people being killed, you know? And when we don't do everything on our end to ensure that happens, or to try to ensure that happens, that doesn't excuse the provocations and the things that, you know, the Vladimir Putin or Hitler or anybody else did to bring that conflict about themselves. You know, the analogy that I used is, you know, if there's police outside a house at a hostage situation, and there's a father who's, you know, just cracked out on meth, paranoid, psychotic, believes he's just under siege by the whole world, and the cops are outside. And rather than trying to de-escalate that situation, they're mocking him. They're telling him, you're never getting out of this alive. You know, they're blasting loud music like they were doing to the poor people at Waco, Texas all night so they can't sleep, to make them even more deranged, and just applying this maximum pressure approach. And then it ends in a murder-suicide. If you criticize the behavior of the police in that, you're not saying, you know, that guy in there who just murdered his family is better than them, or they're worse than him or something. It's saying that, like, these are two different classes of offense. And so when I look at somebody like Winston Churchill or somebody like George Bush and Saddam Hussein, do I think George Bush is a worse human being than Saddam Hussein? Of course not. But if I'm going to criticize anybody about the Iraq War and why it happened and why it wasn't avoided, it's going to be George Bush. It's not going to be Saddam Hussein, you know? And especially when, you know, if after that hostage standoff ends in a murder-suicide, you're the grandparents and your daughter and your grandkids are now dead. And you find out that, you know, the husband was actually like sending messages out to the police saying, he'll come out if this, he'll come out if that. And they were just not only ignoring him, but throwing them back in his face, making fun of him, et cetera, which is the kind of thing that you saw. I think people don't like to hear this, but, you know, again, Pat Buchanan, many others, Nicholson Baker's great book, Human Smoke, covers this a lot. You know, the Germans in 1939 and 1940 made several peace offers, and in the historical sources show very clearly that they did not want to fight Britain. They did not want to fight France. That doesn't mean they were peaceful. It doesn't mean they were teddy bears or anything like that. What it means is that there was, or at least seemed to be, a potential off-ramp from World War. Was it going to save Poland? No. Was it going to save the Polish Jews in the western half that were under German power? Probably not. That doesn't, you know, it's not to say that these are a bunch of cuddly teddy bears who aren't responsible for any of this. It's saying that on our end, did we do everything we could to avoid the worst possible outcome, which is the outcome that actually happened, right? The greatest slaughter in the history of humanity. And I think that it's very easy case to make that not only did we not do that, and when I say we, this is the thing too. When I say we, I'm talking about Winston Churchill, and it's why I get more. I have like I've been very, very critical of like Israel's behavior in Gaza since October 7th, and I tell like my friends many of whom are Israelis or others are just very pro-Zionist, pro-Israel people. They'll ask, why don't you criticize Hamas? Why don't you condemn what Hamas is doing? And I say, because Hamas, like what I'm doing with Israel here is, I have like a drunk friend who's outside a bar throwing bricks at a bunch of Harley Davidsons that are all lined up, with a bunch of bikers inside. And I'm trying to get that guy under control before he gets himself hurt. You know what I mean? This is my side. These are my people, my guys. And so that's why I care more what they do. And I'm not going to get, all morally, I'm not going to get all worked up to morally condemn Hamas or, because we know, Hamas sent suicide bombers onto city buses in the middle of the day. Like we don't have to, we don't have to have long discussions about the moral position of Hamas. It's not. Another example I give is like after the Abu Ghraib scandal broke in 2004, somebody were to say, why aren't you talking about Al-Qaeda in Iraq? You're only talking about what the U.S. forces do wrong. Why aren't you talking about how barbaric Al-Qaeda in Iraq is? Because it's not that I don't care, but like, because those are not my people. Like those are not the people who I expect to behave any differently, And that's true of the man in the house and with his family. And it's true of these other situations where we have to do what we can, regardless of the behavior of the other side, to try to avoid the worst outcome.
It's interesting that, as you say, World War II yields such an unimaginably horrific outcome. I mean, the worst outcome of anything we've ever seen in world history. And yet, at the same time, we've somehow been persuaded to believe that it was the best possible outcome. That anything else would have been worse. Well, sorry, I don't think the burden of proof belongs on me. When the worst outcome imaginable occurs, I think it makes perfect sense and is the humanitarian thing to do, to think, well, I wonder if maybe some of these lives could have been saved with a different combination of diplomacy and military activity and money and whatever. Maybe this would have worked a little bit better. Maybe that would have worked a little bit better. Maybe we can learn something that will prevent this many people from dying in the future. I mean, I don't see what's particularly inhumane about that.
Well,
now, can I just ask you, what's your background?
Oh, I was an engineer for the Department of Defense for 20 years. I was served some time in the military, and then I was an electrical engineer for the Department of Defense. So it's a good thing I'm not still working for them, because after last week, I would almost certainly have my security clearance pulled. So
that is just crazy. How long have you been doing the show?
I started in 2015. Yeah, I've always been a nerd with my nose in a book, my whole life since I was a kid. And it's just how I spent all my free time and as an adult as well. So, but I was, I was not teaching history at a university or something. I was going out, spending 8 to 10 months a year, usually overseas, working with U.S. forces and our allies on missile defense systems primarily.
So you have been doing this for a little while, and I'm just thinking about Dave Smith's experience, because he tells me that when he gets started, he went a couple of years getting no traction whatsoever, just nothing. But he just kept at it. And eventually he did get traction. And of course, now he has completely off the charts traction. Was that like what happened for you?
Sort of, yeah. So, I have episodes that are 7 hours long. Like some of them, right? Like I did a 7-episode, 32-hour long series on Jonestown. And the issues sort of related to it, and one of those episodes is like 7.5 hours long. So that's not for everybody, It's a niche genre, and say, and so summer of 2021, I had, even at that point, I had some people who had become fans, like my friend Jocko Willink. some others who had become fans just sort of independently and were sort of helping put the work out there. But by summer of 2021, I still had a small but very, very, very dedicated listener group. And then in July of 2021, I wrote a thread on Twitter to my 7,000 or so followers or something like that about why people who are sort of your sort of normie conservative across America, why they felt the way they did about the 2020 election. And it just blew up. And this was not the first time that I took over Twitter for a day or two. Like for a couple days, that was the viral thing, and I was sort of out of nowhere. And so it just kind of started taking off. Again, I had 7,000 Twitter followers, and then at 5:30 or so that evening, my friends are calling me up saying, "Turn on Tucker Carlson right now." And he's spending a whole 15-minute segment reading and commenting on it. It's pretty surreal. And then the next day at CPAC, Donald Trump called me out by name. And so, yeah, kind of like got a lot of attention that way.
Did you remind Tucker about this when you saw him?
Oh, he knows. Yeah, he knows.
Oh, he made the connection?
Oh, yeah, we've been in contact for a long time.
Okay.
Yeah. He had me on his Fox Nation interview show a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago or something like that. And we've kept in touch ever since. So can I get, I don't want to derail the direction you want to take this, but there is one thing that I wanted to point out too, about a point you made a second ago, that it would be nice if we could learn the right lessons from these events to apply the next time, right? I told you I did a long series on Jonestown. And that's, for people who don't know, that's the cult/revolutionary movement that in 1978, over 900 members down at this settlement that they had built in Guyana and South America all committed mass suicide together. Don't drink the Kool-Aid is from Jonestown. Although Kool-Aid should sue over that because it was Flavor Aid, actually. But and so I got real deep into that. I mean, really, really, really deep into that story. There's nothing that's been written on it I haven't read. I spent a long time basically dreaming about the story. Like, that's how focused on it I was. And one of the things that I came away with in that story, was that last year in Jonestown, which is what all the documentaries and everything all focus on, because that's like the really crazy part. It was just the last year. I mean, these people have been together for 20 years, and they all went down to Jonestown like a year before the tragedy. And by the time they get down there, and over the course of that year, these people are, I mean, Jim Jones himself, but the movement in general has become extremely paranoid. I mean, they feel like literally like the CIA is planning to come and kidnap their children and kill all the adults so they can take the children off to brainwash them and stuff. And they believe this. And part of the reason they believed it, they considered themselves like a left-wing revolutionary movement. They were very plugged in to the movements of the 60s and 70s. They had their heroes like Huey Newton, Angela Davis, people like that, literally calling into Jonestown and being put over the loudspeaker, telling the people, we know the whole world's after you. We know the government's after you. Don't worry, we have your... So just reinforcing this sense of siege and paranoia, right? And the authorities, pushed to a large degree by a group of kind of bitter former members who helped create the situation and then bailed out like right as the car was on fire and headed toward a cliff. They toward the end, they took that maximum pressure approach. They were humiliating Jim Jones personally in the media. They were letting them know and making them feel, you take this explosive situation with these people who already feel just completely backed into a corner, and do everything you can to reinforce the idea that there's no way out of this for you. And of course, it ends in a mass suicide. And unfortunately, the lesson that we took from that was these people are crazy. Jim Jones was crazy. The problem is that we didn't go in soon enough or hard enough. That's the problem. That's what went wrong in this situation. If we had gone in harder, sooner, we could have prevented this whole thing. And that was in a lot of people's minds 15 years later during the Waco siege. So that on top of, that was the last scenario that the U.S. authorities had to deal with. It was like that. It was the reference point that everybody had in mind. And so they looked at it as, we're going to correct that mistake. We're going to do it differently. And so in addition to just the vindictiveness of the law enforcement people on the ground, from a political level and just in the media and everything else, that completely 180 degrees false, wrong lesson from Jonestown, in my opinion, helped lead to the Waco massacre, And so we do that again, like World War II. I think we've been doing that rather than asking what could we have done differently to potentially avoid this situation becoming what it did. Are there any things that we could have done on our end that would have led to, that would have resulted in fewer Jews dying and fewer people being killed? Is there anything that we could have done differently? Instead of having those conversations and really being honest with ourselves about it, we've, really warded people off with literally threats to their careers and their reputations from even asking those questions. And the one sort of counterfactual that is allowed is it might have been avoided if we'd all listened to people like Winston Churchill and, gone in hard and heavy before they got so strong. And that has informed our response and our justification to every war since then.
What was it? Was there one particular moment or incident or intellectual discovery that made you say, things are not always as they appear. I'm going to have to dig a little bit sometimes to get to the truth?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I just mentioned. I was very fortunate that my first political experience, I guess, you can remember things when you're a really little kid. And, I saw George H.W. Bush give a campaign speech when I was 8 years old or something. But that was just a kid watching a show or something. But the first thing that I was actually thinking about in a political way and processing as, it wasn't an adult. I was only 12 or 13 years old. Wasn't thinking about it like an adult, but processing it sort of as somebody who's more just aware of what's going on, right? Was the Waco incident. And fortunately, I spent a lot of time with my grandfather back then, and my grandfather knew right away what was going on there and the holes in the media narrative. And he made sure that I knew it too. And so that experience of watching that happen to those people, watching those people be murdered, it was really a formative and some might say it's biased my perspective to a degree, that maybe, if I were completely objective, I would lighten up on a bit, but that was for sure the formative experience and I've been that way ever since.
I would like to give people a link to what you're doing, but you've got the Substack, you have the show, so definitely give out a link. But I'm going to post them both in the description of the video and also at tomwoods.com/2544. But if there were only one link you could give out verbally, what would it be?
I suppose the Substack. I put all my content there. All of the long form history podcasts are free. I don't have any sponsors, thank God, at this point. But I put all those out for free. The Substack has paywall content, but all of the free stuff is on there as well. And that is subscribe.martyrmade.com.
Okay, I'm going to make sure that gets put there. And of course, I'll put people can follow you on Twitter. I'll put that on there as well. Let me conclude by asking this: what's your next big project?
Yeah, so that's actually what started the conversation with Tucker. So I'm currently in the middle of a series on different episodes in the history of the American labor movement, right? So I did an episode on the Battle of Blair Mountain. I did one on the New York City teachers' strike in 1968. I've been working on one for a while on Bacon's Rebellion and indentured servitude and slavery in America. And I was going to do one on the Haymarket Affair and so forth. And then I was going to do a 2 or 3 episode series on the Liberian Civil War, which I've been working on for a while. But I think at this point, I need to accelerate the World War II project that I've been working on for a couple of years now. But it has been, I've been doing background reading and preparation research for, probably about 3 years, like really earnestly. Obviously, I've been reading about World War II my whole life, but really systematically preparing the notes and the research. And that was probably not going to start for another year or so, but it's going to be called Enemy, the Germans' War. And I'm going to try to tell the story of the Second World War from the perspective of German people. And because again, I think it's important. At the beginning of my Tucker episode, there are a lot of people who hated me by the end of it because of the stuff we've been talking about now. But at the beginning of it, they were nodding their heads along because I was telling Tucker that whenever I do any kind of a story, whether it was my Israel-Palestine story, whether it was Jonestown, where you're dealing with like a literal delusional psychopathic cult leader, that I don't start the first episode of anything until I really feel like I can empathize with everybody in the story. And that's just a rule for me. And everybody thinks that's very laudable, that's a very noble way to approach any topic until you run into a story like World War II and you try to treat the Germans like human beings and place them in their time and place in a way that, that doesn't just retell the story that you had this sophisticated cultural superpower, the leading nation in Europe that all of a sudden turned into demons for 15 years or so, and then went back to being normal like they are now. I think everybody on some level knows that story is unsatisfying, and people want to know, why did that happen? And how did things look from the inside? And again, like, that's not any kind of a justification, but I think it's important, and I think it's interesting.
Well, I will very much look forward to this material. Obviously, the iron is hot now, and that's when you want to strike. So it makes sense that you would accelerate that project. Well, Darryl Cooper, I really appreciate your time and the fact that you endured something that a lot of people, you make it seem like it was no big deal, but a lot of people would have crumbled under that kind of pressure, and you didn't. So that too is a great service to the rest of us as an inspiration that, yeah, you can stare them down and come out the other side and be okay. So thanks so much.
Anytime, Tom. Thank you.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And speaking of forbidden topics, check out nationaldivorce.com, where I have my free ebook on that subject, which may become more and more relevant as time goes on. See you next time.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.